They didn't need whips, prisons, or armies. And yet, entire villages obeyed their every command. No one dared challenge them, not because they were strong, but because they were smart. Behind the stone walls of medieval manors, lords ruled with invisible chains, woven from land, loyalty, and fear of the unknown. But how exactly did they pull it off? And why did no one ever resist? They ruled without standing armies, without daily violence, without constant threats. And yet, entire communities followed their will. At first glance, the medieval lord appears powerful because of the sword. Castles, armor, and armed knights project an image of dominance. But in truth, brute force was rarely used. It wasn't sustainable. It wasn't necessary. Control in medieval Europe was far more subtle, embedded in laws, customs, and unspoken agreements. A system where obedience became second nature. Feudal lords didn't need to draw weapons daily because the structure of society did the work. For them, at the heart of it was land. In a world without salaries, pensions, or state welfare, land was everything. It fed families, bred livestock, and passed from one generation to the next. The lords owned it, and those who lived on it, worked it, and depended on it, had no choice but to follow the expectations that came with it. Power wasn't enforced through violence. It was embedded in survival. Most peasants were not slaves, but their freedom was limited by design. Serfs were bound to the manor, not by chains, but by tradition and obligation. They could not freely leave. They owed a portion of their labor, harvest, or livestock to the lord. This wasn't enforced with daily patrols or fear of beatings. It was accepted as a legal, social, and even moral duty. And those who defied it often found themselves isolated or punished not by force, but by the withdrawal of access to land, to tools, to protection. The illusion of choice was key. Lords offered protection from bandits or rival clans. They offered mills to grind grain, ovens to bake bread, and courts to settle disputes. But none of this was free. Using the lord's mill meant paying a fee, and using any other mill might be illegal. This quiet control made resistance difficult, even pointless. The very systems that peasants relied on were owned and operated by the lord. Soft control also spread through culture. Lords held local courts, hosted feast days, sponsored churches, and stood as moral and legal figures in village life. Even in language, the hierarchy was reinforced with titles like my lord and customs that demanded public displays of deference. The peasants were not trained to rebel. They were trained to belong to their land, their church, and their place in the social order. Power in medieval Europe was rarely loud. It was quiet, constant, and embedded in every part of daily life. The sword stood ready, but it was the rules, the rituals, and the roles, not the blade, that kept entire villages in line in medieval Europe. Most people never traveled more than a few miles from where they were born. Not because they lacked curiosity, but because they couldn't. Serfs, the backbone of the rural economy, were legally tied to the land. They weren't slaves, but they weren't free either. Their status was fixed, inherited, and almost impossible to escape. The feudal system was built around landholding. Kings granted vast estates to nobles in exchange for loyalty and military support. These nobles, in turn, relied on the labor of peasants to extract value from the land. The majority of these peasants were serfs, bound to the manor by custom, law, and survival. They couldn't sell the land, but neither could they leave it. When a manor changed hands, The serfs were included in the transfer, like livestock or tools. It wasn't just land ownership, it was people ownership, without the terminology of slavery. Serfdom was hereditary. If a man was born a serf, so were his children. His rights were minimal, but his obligations were extensive. He owed his lord labor, typically 2 to 3 days of unpaid work each week, known as week work. This could mean plowing fields, repairing roads, or harvesting the lord's crops. During peak seasons like planting and harvest, the demands increased. On top of that, serfs owed rent in the form of grain, livestock, or coin if they had any, along with boon work, which could be called in at any time. Serfs also had to pay for necessities the lord controlled. To grind grain, they had to use the lord's mill and pay a toll. To bake bread, they had to use the lord's oven. Even collecting wood from the forest or pasturing animals came with restrictions. Breaking these rules risked fines from the manor. A court presided over by the same lord who profited from the penalties. Yet, despite all this, physical force was rarely needed. The system worked because the alternatives were worse. Serfs couldn't legally marry outside the manor without permission. They couldn't leave without buying their freedom, a nearly impossible feat. Fugitives who fled were hunted down or, more commonly, lost access to everything they needed to survive. Without land, tools, or protection, life beyond the manor was bleak and short. There were exceptions. In some regions, serfs could become free after living in a chartered town for a year and a day. But towns were rare, and travel was dangerous. The legal loopholes that allowed escape were narrow and heavily guarded by custom. The binding of serfs to land wasn't enforced by soldiers. It was enforced by law, religion, and economic necessity. Lords didn't need chains. The law did the binding. The church preached obedience. The fields kept people fed, and thus, in place by the 13th century, the rigid structures of serfdom were beginning to loosen in some parts of Europe. But in places like Eastern Europe, serfdom would intensify over the coming centuries. For millions, the idea of freedom remained just that, an idea, unreachable from the muddy fields where they were born, worked, and buried. In medieval Europe, loyalty wasn't written into laws. It was spoken, sworn, and sealed with ritual. The entire feudal order rested on oaths, not contracts, not constitutions, just words, and the weight those words carried. A king stood at the top, but his reach extended only as far as the nobles who pledged loyalty to him. These men, the great barons and dukes, weren't paid officials. They were bound by a sacred agreement, homage and fealty. In a public ceremony, a vassal would kneel, place his hands between those of his lord, and swear to serve with life and limb. In return, he received land, a fief, and the right to govern it as his own. The ritual wasn't symbolic. Breaking that oath could mean ruin, shame, or war. The web didn't stop there. Lords who received land from the king repeated the process with their own followers. Knights were granted smaller parcels of land, manors, in exchange for military service. A single lord might command the loyalty of dozens of knights, each sworn to fight on his behalf. These layers of obligation formed a vast, decentralized network of power. Authority wasn't held. It was delegated, reinforced by a culture where personal honor was currency. But the chain extended even further. Peasants, especially free tenants, also swore fealty, not in grand ceremonies, but in local gatherings. They pledged obedience, labor, and dues to their immediate lord, and in return, They received protection, tools, and access to land. For the serfs, who had fewer rights, this oath took on a different form. They were born into their position, but they too were expected to show loyalty, attend court, and fulfill their duties. The system expected everyone to know their place, and to honor it. Trust was everything. There were no police, no central bureaucracy, no standing army. If a vassal broke his oath, the entire structure risked collapse. Lords depended on the loyalty of their knights to raise armies. Kings depended on their barons to enforce laws. Without oaths, there was nothing holding the system together, just isolated pockets of land and men with swords. This is why betrayal was treated as more than treason. It was heresy. The Church blessed these oaths, reinforcing the idea that breaking them was a sin against God. By the 12th century, the rituals became more formalized, with clerics present, relics invoked, and Bibles used in the swearing. The sacred was fused with the political. Feudal power wasn't absolute, it was precarious, and that's why the web of oaths mattered. It wasn't just about land or titles, it was about identity, expectation, and a world where your word was often your only security. In the absence of paperwork and enforcement, spoken loyalty built kingdoms. And when it fractured, entire realms unraveled. In medieval Europe, power wasn't just political, it was sacred. Lords ruled manners, but the Church ruled minds. And for much of the Middle Ages, the two worked hand in hand. This wasn't accidental. It was a calculated alignment between the sword and the cross by the 10th century. Feudal lords had discovered that brute strength alone wouldn't keep people in line. But religion could. The Church didn't just offer salvation, it explained the world. It defined right and wrong, structured time through its calendar, and touched nearly every aspect of daily life, from birth to burial. Lords understood its influence and used it. Clergy often served as the literate advisors to the nobility. Bishops and abbots managed lands, collected tithes, and advised kings on matters of law and governance. In return, the Church received protection, land grants, and political backing. Cathedrals were funded, monasteries were built. Lords secured their legacy not just through bloodlines, but through patronage of holy institutions. In village churches, sermons taught that every man had his place. The three orders model, those who pray, those who fight, and those who work, was not just social theory, it was theology. Lords, as those who fought, were seen as chosen instruments of divine will. Resistance to a lord wasn't just rebellion, it was blasphemy. This idea wasn't hidden. It was carved into stone, painted onto chapel walls, and repeated in every homily. When serfs heard the Mass, they heard Latin words they couldn't understand, but they saw the Lord kneeling at the front pew next to the priest. The message was clear. The earthly hierarchy mirrored the heavenly one. God ruled heaven, the king ruled the realm, the Lord ruled the manor, and the peasant, he labored as God intended. Tithes 1/10 of a peasant's produce were owed to the Church, but the Church often leased its own lands to lords, who collected both rent and tithe. In some cases, lords acted as patrons of local churches and appointed parish priests. Control of religion and land blurred until the two were almost indistinguishable in exchange for loyalty to the Church. Lords received legitimacy. Coronations took place in cathedrals. Crusades were sanctioned by the Pope. Even acts of violence could be justified as holy, provided they aligned with Church interests. When a noble founded a monastery, He wasn't just securing salvation, he was buying loyalty, narrative, and influence. The alliance wasn't without tension. There were conflicts, most famously, the investiture controversy of the 11th century, when Pope Gregory VII challenged Emperor Henry IV's right to appoint bishops. But even then, both sides agreed on one thing: faith and power were inseparable to the average villager. It didn't matter whether control came from a sword or a sermon, both pointed in the same direction. And that alignment between secular rule and divine order kept lords in power long after their swords had been sheathed. Justice in medieval villages didn't come from distant kings or royal officials. It came from the manor itself. The Lord's Court was the center of legal life, not just a place of punishment, but a mechanism of control. Quiet, local, and deeply embedded in the rhythms of rural society. The manorial court, or court baron, met several times a year, usually in the Lord's Great Hall, or another designated site on the estate. It was attended by local tenants, sometimes as jurors, sometimes as witnesses, and always as subjects under the court's authority. There were no lawyers, no police, just the reeve, the steward, and the lord, or his appointed bailiff, presiding over disputes and enforcing the customs of the manor. The types of cases brought before the court reflected daily life: boundary disputes, unpaid rents, the failure to perform labor services, or the illegal use of common resources like pasture or woodland. If a tenant ground grain at any mill other than the Lord's, it was considered a serious offense. If pigs foraged in the wrong part of the forest, it was a court matter. Even brewing ale without permission required approval and could result in a fine. Justice wasn't abstract, it was financial. The manor court's most common sentence was a fine, payable to the lord, that made enforcement efficient. There were no jails, and corporal punishment was rare. The goal wasn't rehabilitation or revenge, it was revenue and order. The court operated as a system to maintain obligations, secure income, and resolve tensions before they turned into open defiance. The system relied heavily on social pressure. Tenants knew each other. Jurors were drawn from the village. Everyone understood the customs, because they were the customs of their own lives. If someone refused to appear, the court could issue an essoin, a formal excuse, but repeated absences led to amercement, escalating fines for contempt. It didn't take force to bring people in. The fear of losing land or favor with the Lord was enough. Over time, manorial courts developed records, known as court rolls. These detailed the cases, decisions, and penalties issued at each session. Some still survive, handwritten in Latin or Anglo-Norman, offering a vivid look at rural governance from the 13th century onward. They show a system that was decentralized but surprisingly consistent. The court's authority also extended to inheritance and tenancy transfers. When a tenant died, the heir had to pay a heriot, usually the best beast or tool, and formally be admitted as the new tenant. This ritual reinforced the lord's control over property. Even when it was passed within families, no soldiers patrolled these villages. No royal judges traveled from town to town, yet the law was present, local, visible, and respected. The manor court wasn't just a legal institution. It was part of the everyday structure that kept people in place, reinforced the lord's authority, and settled conflict before it became rebellion. In medieval Europe, the tools of control weren't always swords or soldiers. Sometimes it was the village mill, or the forest, or a simple bread oven. Lords didn't need to enforce loyalty with violence when they controlled the very means of survival. Scarcity, engineered and maintained, did the work for them. Every peasant household needed grain, but grinding it into flour wasn't done at home. That task was reserved for the lord's mill. Lords held what was called banal rights, exclusive privileges over essential infrastructure. Tenants were legally obligated to bring the grain to the manor's mill, even if another mill was closer or cheaper. The same rule applied to ovens and wine presses. Using unauthorized alternatives wasn't just discouraged, it was illegal. These rights weren't symbolic. They were enforced in manorial courts and punishable by fines or confiscation. In 13th century France, entire communities were fined for violating milling bans. A peasant who used a hand mill could face penalties, even greater than one who failed to complete labor duties. The control wasn't about efficiency, it was about dependency. By monopolizing the means of basic production, lords kept their tenants locked into a system where defiance meant going hungry. Forests, too, were tightly regulated. Across England, royal and baronial forest laws restricted access to wood, game, and even underbrush. Peasants couldn't hunt deer, cut timber, or even collect fallen branches without permission. These rights, known as istovers and pannage, had to be granted by the lord, and often came with fees or seasonal restrictions. In the forest of Dean or Sherwood, unauthorized hunting was not just a violation of property, it was treated as a form of rebellion. Grazing rights were another point of control. Open pastures were often part of the lord's domain, and tenants had to follow strict rules about when, where, and how many animals they could graze. Overgrazing a meadow or letting pigs wander into the wrong section of woodland could trigger fines, or, in some cases, loss of access entirely. That meant smaller flocks, less manure for fields, and a slower path to self-sufficiency. Even water was sometimes regulated. Access to mills meant access to water-powered technology, and lords controlled the flow. In drought years, water usage could become a matter of privilege. Those with closer ties to the manor might get more leeway. Those on the margins suffered none of this required force. The system created a situation where breaking the rules wasn't just risky, it was unsustainable. A family that couldn't grind grain or pasture livestock had no food. One that couldn't collect wood had no heat. Lords didn't have to compel obedience when they could limit access. In some cases, villagers pushed back. In the early 14th century, peasant resistance in Flanders and parts of the Holy Roman Empire included attacks on mills and the destruction of fences enclosing grazing land. But these acts were rare, dangerous, and often met with harsh retaliation. The genius of feudal control wasn't just in law or ritual, it was in infrastructure. Lords didn't need to be everywhere at once. They just needed to control the things people couldn't live without. And for centuries, they did control in the medieval world, didn't end at the edge of the fields. It continued into the village square, through banners, bread, and blessings. Lords maintained power not only by owning land, but by shaping perception. Public rituals, religious festivals, and seasonal feasts weren't mere entertainment. They were tools, carefully staged performances of order, hierarchy, and obligation. Feast days were scattered throughout the calendar, saint days, harvest festivals, marriages, and coronations. On these occasions, the lord became more than a landholder. He became the face of generosity, protection, and divine favor. He presided over celebrations, financed banquets, and distributed alms or leftover food. Villagers cheered, not because they misunderstood their place, but because these events reinforced it. At harvest festivals, the first fruits were symbolically presented to the Lord, often before being blessed by a priest. During these rituals, everyone saw who stood at the top. When the community came together to light bonfires, drink ale, and sing, the Lord's household watched from raised platforms or separate tables, visible, respected, and unchallenged. Religious processions followed a similar logic. Lords donated to churches, funded chapels, and ensured their banners were carried in public liturgies. On feast days like Corpus Christi or Palm Sunday, entire villages turned out for parades, pageants, and services. The Lord's family often led the procession, dressed in finery, surrounded by retainers. Even in sacred spaces, the hierarchy remained. Clear fear was present, too, not always overt, but always felt. Justice, privilege, and power were on display. In some manners, the Lord's right to punish was ritually emphasized during gatherings. A minor offense might be judged on the same day as a celebration, reminding the village that mercy came from the same hand as punishment. Medieval society relied on memory, not media. People remembered what they saw, who gave out bread, who led the feast, who settled disputes. Visibility was a kind of propaganda, and lords understood that loyalty wasn't just earned through protection or law, it was nurtured through spectacle. In a world without written contracts or mass communication, status had to be performed, and through every feast, procession, and public gathering, the Lord performed it well. Unity among the lower classes posed a threat, but in most medieval villages, that threat rarely materialized, not because peasants lacked grievances, but because they rarely acted together. Lords didn't need spies or secret police. They relied on something simpler, division. The village itself was never truly equal. Free men held land independently, paid fixed rents, and could sometimes move between manors. Serfs, by contrast, were tied to the land, obligated to perform labor, and restricted in travel, marriage, and inheritance. This distinction ran deep, not just in law, but in perception. Free men saw themselves as superior. Serfs saw freemen as privileged. Lords didn't create this hierarchy, but they used it. Customary law reinforced these divides. In courts, freemen might serve on juries. Serfs rarely did. Disputes between classes were resolved with different standards. A freeman might be fined less for the same offense. Even within the same village, people lived under subtly different rules, and they knew it. The differences weren't only legal, they were economic. Freemen often had more livestock, larger plots, or the right to sell surplus goods. Serfs faced more limitations. When grain prices rose or harvests failed, tensions surfaced, not upward, toward the manor, but sideways. Between neighbors, in tight-knit communities, jealousy and rivalry were easy to provoke. Lords did little to ease those tensions. Sometimes they quietly encouraged them. Village offices, like reeve or haywood, roles responsible for managing labor or enforcing regulations, were often filled by locals. These men were caught between duty to the Lord and loyalty to their peers. Choosing one side often meant alienating the other. In practice, this created a cycle of blame. The reeve enforced the rules. The people resented the reeve. The Lord remained above the fray. Festivals and feasts, which brought the village together, also reinforced divisions. Seating arrangements, food portions, and proximity to the Lord's table served as constant reminders of rank. Even in celebration, inequality was displayed. Collective action required shared purpose. But when villagers were fractured by class, duty, and distrust, that purpose was hard to find, and lords understood this. They didn't need to prevent rebellion. They needed to keep the village too divided to attempt one. For centuries, it worked. Most of the time, the system held. Lords ruled, peasants obeyed, and the rhythms of feudal life continued without open defiance. But not always. When the pressure became too great, when taxes surged, harvests failed, or promises were broken, the illusion cracked. In 1381, it cracked completely. The peasants' revolt in England was not a spontaneous riot. It was a coordinated uprising that spread with alarming speed. Triggered by the imposition of a third poll tax in just 4 years, the rebellion drew thousands from across the southeast. Men who had quietly paid dues for a lifetime suddenly refused. From Essex to Kent, they marched, not with pitchforks, but with purpose. At the center was a demand. The end of serfdom, led by figures like Wat Tyler, and inspired by radical preachers such as John Ball. The rebels wanted fixed rents, no forced labor, and the right to work for wages. On June 13, 1381, they entered London. By June 14th, they had stormed the Tower. The Archbishop of Canterbury was beheaded in the street. King Richard II, only 14 at the time, agreed to their demands, promising to abolish serfdom and end labor obligations. But the promise didn't last. Within days, Wat Tyler was killed during a meeting with the king at Smithfield. The movement collapsed and the concessions were revoked. Still, the message had been delivered. For the first time, peasants had challenged the structure, not just in protest, but in negotiation. The fear this created among the ruling class reshaped future policies. No monarch would ever again underestimate the potential for organized revolt from below. Other uprisings surfaced across Europe. In France, the Jacquerie of 1358 erupted in the wake of military defeats, economic hardship, and heavy taxation during the 100 Years' War. In Germany, the Bundschuh movements of the late 15th and early 16th centuries voiced rural discontent with both secular and ecclesiastical landlords. But these rebellions were rare. Most failed quickly, brutally suppressed by professional soldiers or loyal militias. The reasons were consistent. Villagers lacked weapons, coordination, and allies, and most importantly, the system of control based on land, law, religion, and routine was deeply internalized. That's what made revolt exceptional. Not because the peasants lacked anger, but because centuries of layered control had made obedience feel inevitable. When rebellion came, it revealed the limits of that control, but the fact that it was so rare shows just how effective the system usually was. For centuries, medieval lords ruled not through constant violence, but through systems so embedded that resistance became unthinkable. The structures they built, land control, legal authority, religious sanction, and ritual visibility, endured for generations. What made these systems powerful wasn't how often they were enforced, but how rarely they had to be. The peasant knew his duties because they were repeated at court sessions, spoken at mass, and reinforced in every harvest. Owed or fine paid. The lord's power was visible in stone walls, embroidered seals, and public rituals, but its real strength lay in habit. People obeyed not because they were always watched, but because disobedience had been made impracticable, even unimaginable. Even as serfdom declined in the later Middle Ages, gradually replaced by tenant farming, wage labor, or the growing power of towns, the legacy of soft control persisted. The basic idea remained. Those in power rarely needed force when they could shape access. Access to land, access to justice, access to community. Lords who adapted stayed in power. Those who relied on brute force alone often didn't. By the 15th century, many of the old manorial structures were fading in parts of Western Europe. Yet the psychological frameworks remained. Authority still depended on appearances, rituals, and unspoken agreements. In Eastern Europe, serfdom expanded instead of receding, and the logic of control through land, scarcity, and status endured well into the modern period. Today, the tools look different, but the questions are similar. Who controls the structures people depend on? Who decides the terms of access to resources, rights, or representation? And how often is power most effective when it feels like tradition, not coercion? The legacy of invisible rule isn't a relic of the past. It's a reminder that control doesn't always come with force. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in routine and held in place by everything left unsaid.